When Roy Tilley died in the last week of November, his two younger sons divided the family farm between themselves. Brett and Mason received the sugar maples, the barns, the equipment shed, the herd of 60 Hereford cattle, the main house with its stone fireplace and wide front porch, and every acre of workable land, 240 acres of some of the finest farmland in Hartwell County, Vermont. Their mother, Nadine, would keep her right to live in the house for the rest of her life. Roy had signed a revised will 14 days before he passed. The family's lawyer read it on a gray Tuesday morning while sleet moved down from the hills beyond St. Albans and clicked against the office windows. Grant Tilley, Roy's eldest son from his first marriage, received 90 acres of flooded peatland in the far corner of the valley. Everyone in the room knew the parcel. They called it Crow's Bog. Dead birch trees rose from the black water in clusters. Cattails pressed against the fence lines. Muskrats had tunneled beneath every low bank, and the few trails that once crossed the property had long since sunk beneath the surface. No cattle had grazed there in living memory. 2 surveyors had told Roy over the years that draining it would cost more than the land could ever earn back. Grant Tilley was 48 years old, 6 feet tall, and lean through the shoulders, with dark red hair going gray at the temples and large weathered hands that never seemed fully clean of soil. He had a long, quiet face, a broad forehead, deep-set brown eyes, a straight mouth that rarely moved toward either a smile or a frown. He had worked alongside his father since he was old enough to carry a fence post, and had spent the last 6 winters helping Roy through the maple harvest when Brett was busy, and Mason had disappeared somewhere south. He was not a bitter man by nature, but he understood, in the moment Howard Prentice read the last line of the will aloud, that bitterness was being offered to him like a gift he had not asked for. Nadine Colhoun Tilley was 61, narrow through the face with sharp cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair that she kept carefully set even in the middle of a farm winter. She had married Roy when Grant was 16, and had spent the following decades drawing a clear, invisible line between her household and Roy's son from his first wife. She was never openly cruel. She simply made certain that Grant understood, in 100 small ways, that he was a visitor in his own home. Brett Tilley was 40, built thick through the chest, with dark stubble, and a confidence in his voice that had always arrived before any evidence to support it. He dressed well for a farmer, pressed flannel, polished work boots, and had a habit of speaking as though decisions had already been made before anyone else had finished thinking. Beside him sat Mason Tilley, 37, quieter and thinner, with sandy hair that fell to one side and a tendency to agree with whoever had spoken most recently. Mason was not cruel. He had simply never developed the habit of making up his own mind. When Howard Prentice finished reading, Brett turned toward Grant with a look that was almost charitable. "You always liked being out in the bush," he said. "I suppose 90 acres of mud suits you fine." Mason smiled at the floor. Grant looked at Nadine. For just a moment, something crossed her expression that had nothing to do with grief. He picked up the pen and signed. 3 days later, he drove the old truck to the far edge of the property and walked into Crow's Bog through 6 inches of cold November water to reach the trapping cabin his father had built decades earlier. The cabin was barely standing, the roof soft in 2 corners, one window covered in plastic sheeting, the porch tilting hard toward the water. But it was still upright, inside, beneath the rotted floorboards near the cold stove. He felt the edge of something solid. He pulled back the boards and lifted out a rusted tin box. Inside were 19 ledgers, a cloth bag of pencils, and a folded topographic map. He opened the last ledger and turned to the final written page. "Don't ever drain the bog. The cold comes from below." Grant set the ledger down on the tilted table and stood for a long while, listening to the wind move through the birch stands above the water. Then he picked up the first ledger, sat on the edge of the wood box, and began to read. Roy Tilley had started keeping records of Crow's Bog in the spring of the year Grant's mother died. That was 1989. Grant had been 13. The earliest entries were simple. Water level measurements, notes on the beaver activity near the south fence, sketches of the bog's outline at different seasons. But by the early 90s, something had changed in the writing. Roy had begun measuring temperature. He lowered a thermometer into the water at different depths, different times of day, different seasons. He recorded the results in careful columns, date after date, year after year. Grant read the entries over 4 nights by lamplight, his coffee going cold each time he forgot to drink it. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Every major pool in Crow's Bog held water that was significantly colder than the surrounding land, even in August. Not mildly cooler, cold. Roy had measured the 3 deepest pools at 43, 44, and 46 degrees Fahrenheit in the height of summer. He had noted the direction the cold entered each pool, drawn maps of the currents, and marked the spots where the water seemed to rise from below rather than run in from the sides. There were other notes too. Roy had tracked the wild brook trout, speckled trout, he called them, the way old Vermont men did, that appeared in the channels each spring. Not many, never more than a few dozen that Roy could count, but there, year after year. He had sketched them with the careful hand of a man who did not consider himself an artist, but wanted to be accurate. He had noted their condition, their size, the coloring on their bellies in spawning season. On page 41 of ledger number 6, Roy had written a single paragraph that Grant read 3 times before he was certain he understood it. 5 cold pools in this bog. Not surface water, not beaver ponds, cold springs below the peat. Same temperature in July as in January. Speckled trout live here because it is the only water this side of the county cold enough for them. Always thought this was worthless ground. I was wrong. It is not worthless. It is just difficult. Those are not the same thing. Grant closed the ledger and sat in the dark for a long time. He moved into the cabin before Christmas. He patched the roof with corrugated metal sheeting he found behind one of Roy's old outbuildings, replaced the plastic window with a proper pane of glass, and put a new length of stovepipe on the wood stove. He brought his tools, his clothes, his father's 19 ledgers, and a coffee pot. He had enough saved from 25 years of farm work to last roughly 18 months if he spent nothing unnecessary. Across the valley, Brett held a dinner to celebrate the new season. Local farmers and equipment dealers attended. The Hartwell County paper ran a short item about the farm's expansion plans. Mason stood in the background of every photograph with an expression that was trying to look like pride. When Grant appeared in town that winter, people were polite in the careful way that people are polite when they believe someone has failed. A few suggested he ought to sell the bog before spring, when the water would rise and the access road would wash out again. He declined without explanation. He did not drain the bog. He did not chase out the beavers or tear up the cattail stands. Instead, every morning before the sun cleared the birch ridge to the east, he pulled on his waders and walked the property with his father's maps and his own notebook. He pushed a marked stake into the pools to measure depth. He lowered the thermometer, wrote down the numbers, compared them to Roy's columns from 30 years earlier. The cold was still there, all 5 pools, 42 to 46 degrees, even in February, even when the surrounding creek had ice 2 inches thick. By late winter, he understood what his father had seen. The 5 pools sat at descending elevations, each one slightly lower than the one above. Cold water entered each pool from below, not trickles, but consistent upwellings from springs buried deep beneath the peat. The beaver dams slowed the water without stopping it, creating depth and stability in each pool. The dead birch canopy overhead kept them shaded through summer. The water passed through root systems and sediment as it moved from pool to pool, arriving at the lowest point clear and cold and full of oxygen. Roy had understood it. He had simply not had enough years left to act on what he understood. In ledger number 12, near the back, Grant found a map drawn in pencil and folded twice. Roy had marked the 5 pools in red and traced the flow between them with careful arrows. Beside the lowest pool, he had written 2 words in handwriting that looked like a man trying to be certain: Brook Trout. Grant stood in the February snow and looked out across the white surface of the bog, the dead birch standing like fence posts above it. He felt, without entirely knowing why, that his father was still speaking to him. Just slowly, through 19 ledgers and 30 years of careful numbers. By spring of his 2nd year, he had borrowed a modest amount against the property, bought timber and wire mesh for water control gates, and ordered 800 juvenile brook trout from a hatchery in the Northeast Kingdom. They arrived in insulated tanks on a cool May morning, small and vivid, orange-bellied, with green marbled backs and white-tipped fins, each one no longer than a man's finger. Grant released them into the coldest upper pool and stood watching until the last one disappeared into the dark water. He had not allowed himself to hope very much since the day the will was read. That morning, for the first time in almost 2 years, he let himself hope a little. The hope lasted 7 months. In December, 3 days of heavy rain came down from the north, and the bog rose faster than the control gates could manage. The upper dam began to weaken by midnight. Grant worked through the storm alone, wading in chest-high water, dragging sandbags and cut branches toward the breach, while the rain ran sideways across the pools. By 3 in the morning, the center of the dam gave way. A wall of cold black water pushed through the channels. When the sky lightened enough for him to see the pools, more than half his brook trout were gone, carried out through the broken gate and into the lower creek beyond the property line. Grant stood at the edge of the ruined dam in the rain, watching the water level drop. 2 afternoons later, Brett drove past on the county road and slowed his truck beside Grant's fence line. He was dry and clean in a new barn coat, one elbow resting on the open window. "Heard you had some trouble," he called across the field. "A swamp doesn't stop being a swamp just because a man wants it to." Grant turned back to his gate and kept working. He reduced his stock, rebuilt the dam with stone reinforcement, and installed overflow channels to prevent the same collapse. By the following summer, 3,000 trout were growing in the 5 pools. He sent water samples to a lab in Burlington. The results confirmed what Roy's ledgers had suggested for decades: high dissolved oxygen. Nearly 0 sediment, consistent cold. Better conditions than most commercial operations could create artificially. Then, in the last week of August, Grant found the lower water control gate lying flat in the mud beside the 4th pool. The bolts had not sheared, they had been removed with a wrench. The pool had drained overnight into the lower meadow. Grant worked for 6 hours with nets and buckets, moving fish from the warming shallows to the remaining cold pools. But by afternoon, the banks were lined with dead brook trout. The smell settled over the property for days. Sheriff Earl DuPont arrived that evening. Earl was 56, broad through the middle with a gray mustache and the careful manner of a man who had spent 3 decades listening before he spoke. He had grown up on a dairy farm 2 concessions over and did not have much patience for people who used money as a substitute for ethics. He examined the gate, the bolts, the soft ground beside the service track. "This wasn't weather," he said quietly. Someone knew exactly what to remove. He found tire marks on the access road. He found a cigarette stub ground out carefully, but not carefully enough. Neither piece was sufficient on its own. The answer came 11 days later from a young man named Jesse Polk. Jesse was 26, slight and pale with light brown hair that fell over one eye and a thin scar along the line of his jaw from a chainsaw accident 2 seasons earlier. He worked occasional days for several farms in the county and had the eyes of someone who had learned young that honesty was a luxury that cost you work you needed. He came to Grant's gate on a Tuesday morning and stood in the road for a long moment before he spoke. Brett had paid him $200 to pull the bolts from the gate. Brett had told him no fish would actually die, that the pool was too deep for the drain to empty it completely. Jesse had found out afterward what had really happened and had not been able to sleep properly since. The anger that moved through Grant as he listened was the quiet kind, which was the only kind he had ever trusted because it did not cloud his thinking. He did not drive to the main farm. He walked Jesse to his truck, took his phone number, and called Earl DuPont that afternoon. Jesse signed a statement. Brett denied everything, then went quiet, then stopped returning calls from the county office. The matter moved forward slowly, the way such matters do in small counties. The bank sent a payment notice at the end of September. Grant sold his truck and bought an older one. He sold the last of his father's carpentry tools. A broad set of hand planes and chisels Roy had kept in a locked case since before Grant was born. He did not tell anyone he had done this. He simply did it and kept working. On the last Tuesday of October, a nor'easter came in hard from the northeast and dropped 4 inches of rain on the hills above Crow's Bog in 36 hours. Grant spent most of the second night at the upper dam, watching the water rise. Just before dawn, a section of the limestone shelf on the north hillside above the 4th pool collapsed under the weight of the saturated ground. A fan of pale rock and old soil slid into the edge of the bog, exposing a deep hollow beneath the roots of a large yellow birch. Water came out of that hollow with a force Grant had never seen anywhere else on the property. Clear water, cold water, rising from well below the surface, with a sound like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. He knelt in the mud in the dark and lowered the thermometer into it. 49 degrees Fahrenheit, in the last week of October. He ran back to the cabin, pulled ledger number 12 from the shelf, and opened it to the page he had nearly memorized. His father had sketched the north hillside, labeled the yellow birch, and written beside it in pencil so faint it was almost gone. Main source, buried in the 1989 slide, too deep to reach without it showing itself. Wait for it. Grant stood in the doorway of the cabin, holding the ledger against his chest while rain ran off the porch roof into the mud. His father had known, had found it decades ago and lost it to the same kind of storm, had spent 30 years watching for it to come back, had left him this place because he believed Grant would still be there when it did. He sat down on the porch step in the rain and, for the first time since the day the will was read, allowed himself to cry. Not from grief, though grief was certainly present, from something more precise, the feeling of being known completely by someone who was no longer alive to say it. 3 years after the hidden spring came back to the surface, Crow's Bog no longer resembled the worthless parcel Grant had signed for in a lawyer's office. The dead birch still stood above portions of the water. The beavers still rebuilt their dams each autumn, and Grant let them. But 5 clear channels now carried cold spring water through all 5 pools. Screened gates protected the fish during high water, and a small cedar shed stood beside the cabin for packing and handling. Gravel paths crossed the softest ground on low boardwalks. In the pools, thousands of brook trout moved through water that held between 42 and 49 degrees in every season of the year. Spring-fed, stable, cleaner than anything the county had seen outside a laboratory. Grant had not forced the bog into a shape it did not want. He had learned to farm inside the shape it already had. He sold small quantities of fish at first, to a cooperative market in St. Albans, to a restaurant in Burlington that had been requesting local speckled trout for several years. The word spread slowly, the way it always does when the quality is genuine. The change came on an October Saturday at the Burlington Farmers Market, when a man from Montreal walked past Grant's table and stopped without being called over. Claude Moreau was 54, tall and spare, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and the watchful, unhurried face of a man who had made a career out of paying close attention to things other people walked past. He had owned 3 restaurants in Montreal over 30 years, had lost one of them to overexpansion in the late 90s, and had rebuilt his reputation entirely by refusing to put anything on a menu he could not trace back to a specific person who had grown it. He wore a good wool coat completely unsuited to a market parking lot in October and carried a canvas bag with a small restaurant logo stitched near the handle. He picked up one of Grant's packaged fish and turned it over, looking at the coloring through the paper. Then he looked at Grant. "Where does this come from?" he asked, in the precise English of someone who had spoken both languages equally since childhood. "Northern Vermont," Grant said. "My property." "Cold water?" 42 to 49 degrees, year-round, underground springs. Claude set the package down with the careful attention of someone handling something breakable. "I would like to visit," he said. He arrived 2 weeks later, in polished leather shoes that were ruined before he reached the second boardwalk. Grant watched him pick his way along the path with the absorbed gait of someone far more interested in what he was seeing than in the condition of his footwear. Claude spent nearly 3 hours at the bog. He asked about the springs, the temperature gradients, the feed, the harvest frequency. When Grant brought out the ledgers, Roy's 30 years of measurements, the maps, the temperature columns, Claude read in silence for a long time. When he finally looked up, the expression on his face had nothing to do with commerce. "Your father understood something that most people spend a lifetime learning," Claude said. "That the land teaches if you are quiet enough to listen." He ran out of time, Grant said. Claude offered a supply agreement for his Montreal restaurant and 2 others that shared his standards. The price per fish was nearly double what Grant had been receiving locally. Grant accepted on one condition: the number of fish supplied each season would always be set by what the water could support. If the springs ran low in a drought year, the order would be reduced accordingly. No exceptions, and no negotiation on that point. Claude shook his hand. "That," he said, "is exactly why I want to serve your fish." Within 18 months, Crow's bog speckled trout appeared on restaurant menus in Montreal and Ottawa. Food writers came in spring and photographed the bog in early morning light, the mist lifting off the pools, the dead birch white above the dark water. The waiting list for supply agreements grew longer each season. Grant maintained it without apology. He had not gone into this to be large. He had gone into it to be right. Across the valley, the main Tilley farm began to fail. Brett had borrowed heavily through the expansion years. New equipment, breeding stock, 200 additional acres of leased maple stands, a new syrup processing facility. The loans were tied to yield projections that assumed average rainfall and stable commodity prices. For 2 years, the numbers held close enough. Then came the drought. 2 consecutive summers brought rainfall 30% below normal to Hartwell County. The maple sap runs shortened. Yields fell by 1/3 the first year and nearly half the second. Hay prices doubled. The creek that supplied the cattle pond ran low and slow. Brett borrowed more to cover the shortfall, certain that one strong season would straighten everything out. Mason signed what Brett placed in front of him, as he always had. The season did not come. Crow's Bog held water through both dry summers without interruption. The underground springs were unaffected by what happened at the surface. The brook trout grew well. Conservation researchers from the University of Vermont arrived in the second drought year and spent 2 weeks documenting the spring-fed system, its stability, its water quality, its resistance to seasonal variation. Their published report described Crow's Bog as one of the most significant cold-water wetland fisheries in the northeastern United States. The estimated value of the property exceeded that of any individual parcel on the original Tilley farm. The bank posted foreclosure notices at the main farm in January. The house, barns, equipment, cattle, and 240 acres would go to public auction in March. Brett came to Crow's Bog on a Wednesday evening in February. After dark, Grant heard his truck on the access road and walked out to meet him at the gate. Brett was thinner than Grant had seen him in 20 years. His jacket was not the pressed flannel of better times. His face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been certain of himself for most of his life and had recently had all of that certainty removed at once, leaving nothing underneath it. He crossed the first boardwalk carefully, not from fear of the water, but because his knees seemed unsure of him. He stopped in front of Grant and looked out across the pools, where the half-moon caught the surface and showed the slow movement of fish beneath it. "I need 40 acres, Brett said. The lower section. Enough to secure another loan. Name your price." Grant said nothing. Brett's voice dropped to something that barely qualified as a voice at all. "I am asking you." Grant looked past him toward the birch trees, white and still in the February dark. "You told me this land wasn't worth $50 an acre," Grant said. Brett lowered his eyes. "You paid a young man $200 to empty my fourth pool. My fish died in a ditch." Brett said nothing. There was nothing to say. Grant turned back toward the cabin. "Go home, Brett. I'll see you at the auction." The auction was held on the second Saturday of March in the Hartwell County Agricultural Hall. Snow had come overnight, and the parking lot was gray-white in the early morning light. People who had watched the Tilley name in this county for generations came out. Farmers, buyers, a few newspaper reporters, and the simply curious. Several had come expecting to watch Grant Tilley take the revenge that everyone assumed he had been preparing for years. Brett and Mason stood near the entrance with the look of men wearing coats that belonged to earlier versions of themselves. Nadine sat inside on a wooden bench, her carefully maintained appearance finally showing its age beneath the fluorescent lights. The machinery sold in lots, then the cattle, then the land, the house, the barns, and 240 acres of Hartwell County farmland offered as one parcel. The bidding was quiet and deliberate in the way that serious money tends to be. Two regional buyers pushed the price in steady increments. Then Grant, who had been standing near the wall with his arms folded and his face arranged in its usual expression, raised his number. He bid twice. The second time the other paddles came down. The auctioneer struck the block. No one in the room spoke for a moment. Then the whispers started, moving through the crowd the way they always do when something that seemed impossible has simply happened. The man who had received 90 acres of flooded peatland now held the deed to the entire Tilley farm. Grant completed the paperwork with the county clerk, accepted the ring of old iron keys. The same keys Roy Tilley had carried every day of Grant's childhood, and walked outside. Brett was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Mason stood a few feet back, looking at the ground. "We'll be gone by Sunday," Brett said quietly. "You don't need to ask us to leave." Grant looked down at the keys in his hand. He thought about Roy teaching all three of them to split wood on a January morning, to read a sapline, to know the difference between a tree that needed cutting and one that needed another season. He thought of the ledgers, the temperature columns, the faded pencil note in Ledger 12. Wait for it. He held the ring of keys out toward Brett. Brett stared at them. "The farm needs managing," Grant said. "You know how to do that. Do it right this time." Brett shook his head, not in refusal, but in the bewilderment of a man who cannot account for what he is seeing. "After everything I did." "Our father did not build that farm to hand to any one of us," Grant said. "He built it so there would be something worth taking care of." Brett's eyes went red at the edges. He pressed his mouth shut and looked up at the sky until he had himself under control. Then he reached out and took the keys. His hand was not steady. Mason stepped forward and put his hand on Grant's arm and left it there without speaking, and Grant let him. Nadine came down the steps last. She stopped in front of Grant and was quiet for a moment, looking at something near the ground between them. "In those last weeks," she said, her voice controlled but not quite steady. "I told Roy you would sell the bog and leave if you received nothing better. I said if you got the worst piece, you would simply disappear." She raised her eyes. "I believed I was protecting my sons. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about that land." Grant looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. He had no interest in prolonging her shame, and none in pretending it was smaller than it was. He simply walked back to his truck, started the engine, and drove home to Crow's Bog. 10 years passed. Crow's Bog speckled trout became what Roy Tilley had always known, without quite having the words for it, that the property could be. University researchers published studies on the spring-fed ecosystem and its resistance to climate variation. Conservation organizations brought students from across Canada and the northeastern United States to walk the boardwalks and learn how cold water wetlands could be farmed without being destroyed. Grant gave brief, accurate tours and answered every question he was asked. He did not enjoy speaking to groups, but he did not consider it optional. The main Tilley farm, under Brett's management and Grant's ownership, became what it should have been from the beginning. A well-run operation, no longer overextended, no longer built on the assumption that confidence and competence were the same thing. At the entrance to Crow's Bog, before the first boardwalk, stood a weathered sign. Grant had cut from a piece of yellow birch, the same species whose roots had held the hidden spring below the hillside for so many years. The words were Roy's, taken from the last page of the first ledger, written in the spring after Grant's mother died. Worthless ground and difficult ground are not the same thing. One has no value. The other simply asks more of you. Every person who came to visit the bog passed that sign first. Most of them read it twice. Some asked who had written it. Grant would say his father's name and leave it at that. Some mornings, when the light was still low and the mist was lifting off the pools, Grant would stand at the edge of the fourth pool. The one above the hidden spring, the one that had nearly ruined him, the one his father had marked on a faded map and written beside, "Wait for it." And he would feel, not for the first time, that Roy was still here, not as a ghost, as something quieter than that, as the cold water still rising, after all these years, from below. If you are standing in the middle of a season that looks like nothing but dead birch and black water, hold on. Not everything that is hidden is gone. Sometimes the ground is simply waiting for you to be patient enough to understand it. And sometimes the person who believed in you most did not have enough time left to say so out loud. But they left you the map. As it is written in Ecclesiastes, there is a time for every purpose under heaven. The cold comes from below, even when the surface gives no sign of it, and the ground that asked the most of you may in the end return the most to you. If this story found you where you needed it today, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Share it with someone who is walking through their own difficult ground right now. You never know whose hidden spring is waiting just beneath the surface. From all of us here at the Quiet Hour Tales, thank you for being with us. We will see you in the next one.